Okay, so we're at the last. Oh, thanks. We're at the last panel of this wonderful conference. So we'll take our time with our papers. And anyway, I'm joking. Okay, so the panel is called "Current Echoes of the Transformation." The first speaker is Sabine Stach. Sorry.
Stach.
Stach. Okay, sorry. And she's a research fellow at the German Historical Institute in Warsaw. She works on Czech and Polish contemporary history, memory, and different modes of historical production in the 21st century. Her dissertation explored the making of political martyrs in the GDR and Czechoslovakia. Since 2017, she's a member of the editorial department of Hosso Kult. The title of her paper is Guided Through Memory, a case study of post-communist tours.
Shall I start now, or you will introduce everyone?
No.
So,
no.
okay. Sorry, I didn't want to.
No, don't worry about it.
Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction, for inviting me, for all of you for staying for this last panel. And also thank you for the opportunity to talk about, I would say, one, let's say, frame of memory, which we only rarely talk about in memory studies, and this is tourism and tourism industry. And I just saw the title of this conference is Memory, is Myth, Memory, and Economy. And I think in a literary sense, this is also what I will touch upon, which is also about commodification of history, of course. But let me go straight into my topic. Where do I have to point to? Okay. So if you join one of the numerous touristic tours, guided tours about the communist past in East Central Europe, you will find the 1990s presented as a weird, as a strange time, as a time of anything goes. In Prague, for example, most of such communism tours will introduce this statue erected on Letná Hill for a short time in 1996. It's a 35 feet tall Michael Jackson put there to advertise his History World Tour, which started in Prague in 1996. The interesting thing about this statue is its very precision. Yes, because it was built on the base of what was once the largest Stalin monument ever, which was on Letná Hill for a couple of years in the 50s. Another clash between symbols of East and West is presented in many touristic tours. Also here in Warsaw, here, for example, the former headquarters of the Polish United Workers' Party became the seat of the stock market in 1991. Today it is a banking and financial center with a Ferrari shop on the ground floor. You might see it here, it's the yellow Ferraris inside. What once had been the heart of communism became the heart of capitalism, so to say. To make sense of that, tour guides usually agree that this expresses some kind of an irony of history. This narration about historical ironies is part of a larger trend to present post-communist cities as cities of contrasts. In the following, I will take a closer look at the memory of post-communism and commercial guided tours. However, I'm not going to provide you with examples of how these years are presented by single anecdotes in these tours. Instead, I would like to move beyond strictly narrative analysis and reflect on the economic and the experiential notion of memory making in global tourism. Therefore, I will try to adapt two different perspectives. After some short remarks about communism tours, I will take up a more performative perspective and try to argue that the Western gaze on communism has to be traced back to pre-1989 tourism and needs to reflect the self-conception of tourists as alternative travelers. And second, I will take a look on the providers of these tours and their biographical backgrounds, without which the image of the 1990s is hardly understandable, as I will show. The observations I'm going to present are all coming from my own ethnographic research. Since 2015, since I'm here in Warsaw, I have participated in many guided tours as a participant observer in Warsaw, in Prague, and in Bratislava, and I have spoken to many guides as well as tour operators. The collapse of the Eastern Bloc and the subsequent economic transformation had, of course, wide-ranging consequences for tourism. On the one hand, free travel situated East Central Europe as an easily reachable destination into the global tourism industry. On the other hand, the communist system left a material heritage, which in itself became the object of increasing touristic interest. Architectural remnants, monuments, and urban settings became the basis of what was usually termed communist heritage tourism. Since about 20 years, this heritage is an important economic resource, especially for private businesses. There are museums of daily life in communism, several nostalgia exhibitions, restaurants in retro styles, as well as different kinds of those themed guided tours who all kind of make use of the past's relics in order to gain economic profit. In the following, I'm going to take a closer look on the latter, on commercial city tours for an English-speaking audience. Between Berlin and Moscow, a wide range of such guided communism tours can be found. All of them promise to give an insight into the communist time and to explain the post-communist present. There are free walking tours, as well as private tours in retro cars, and even bicycle rides along the Iron Curtain. The most popular, or probably the most popular company in Poland are the Crazy Guides in Krakow, not more precisely in Nowa Huta. This company has not only been the first one on the Polish market, it has also become some kind of a role model for newer tours, and it has also attracted quite some researchers' interest. As you can see, there's already some anthropological research on this company. Here in Warsaw, you will find this upper picture, several different operators of private and free walking tours. The most popular, I would say, is Adventure Warsaw. You see the advertisement here. They are offering different kind of communism tours, or actually one tour in two versions, and they also are running a communist museum of communism, which recently moved to the Palác Konstytucji, the Constitution Square, which already proves a bit how successful they are, as they are able to hire a space in this very central location. This offer in Warsaw is marketed very similar to another offer in Bratislava, which you see on the bottom. This is a company called Authentic Slovakia. Its tour is actually not called Communism Tour, but Post-Communist Bratislava Tour, a telling fact, as you will see. And a lot of my examples today will come from this tour in Bratislava. The itineraries of such communism tours do not only include communist environments, but lead through today's urban landscapes with many layers of history. The guide's task is to direct the audience's gazes according to the theme of the tour. Therefore, I understand guided tours as rituals of collective gazing, embedded in particular performative practices, including public and sometimes also non-public places. Into their itineraries, they produce ephemeral themed environments and construct sites through the very process of encountering them. So this is basically my theoretical framework. But what do these tourists actually gaze upon? Since the 1960s, tourism politics in Poland and in Czechoslovakia sought to increase incoming tourism from the West in order to receive more foreign currency. Indeed, more and more travelers from the so-called capitalist foreign countries came to visit the world behind the Iron Curtain. In her analysis of American and German guidebooks about Poland, Joanna Dybiec has carved out that at least since the 1980s, it was promoted, so Poland was promoted mainly as a remote space beyond capitalism. The journeys were staged as time travels into backward societies where forms of life long forgotten in the West had been preserved. And Dybiec is actually calling this the freezer concept. This search for remoteness beyond some kind of a capitalist, let's say, acceleration did of course not end with the collapse of communism. On the contrary, free travel led to a rapid growth of incoming tourism. In the first post-revolutionary weeks and months, the fascination of backwardness met with the idea of an unmediated encounter of history in the making. Guidebooks now highlighted the chance to observe a unique spirit of freedom guidebooks, and by visiting transitional Poland, Czechoslovakia, or also, for example, Romania, to enter some kind of a virgin territory not yet spoiled by mass tourism. However, from the mid-90s, one could not speak of an unknown, wild, non-capitalistic destination anymore. At the one hand, Prague and other cities had become new centers of mass tourism. At the other hand, global tourism underwent a change itself. Temporarily coinciding with the political transition in East Central Europe, it became part of an upcoming experience economy. The trend was more generally, or even globally, towards stronger market segmentation and away from packaged tours. Tour guiding became thus part of a storytelling industry, often based on personal, informal exchange between the guides and the tourists. At the same time, the space itself was reshaped during the 1990s. Much of the communist heritage had been demolished, renovated, or removed from the city centers. Thus, Prague, Warsaw, Bratislava, all these cities increasingly resembled Western cities with the same shops and services. So the question in terms of touristic offers was how to still present them as distinct alternative places. The solution, I would say, were themed offers focusing on the unfamiliar time of communism. In my opinion, the more Poland and other countries in the East lost its image as alternative destinations per se, the more this status was transferred to these single offers. Oh yeah, what did I do? Okay. So coming back to these communism tours in Warsaw and Bratislava, I would say it's not by chance that both are marketed above all as alternative or off-the-beaten-track experiences. So not to be a mainstream, but some kind of looking behind the scenes. That's about this advertisement. What is enacted as communist heritage by the guided tours are different kinds of objects. Of course, first of all, architectural remnants of this time. Here we see the Palace of Culture and Science and the Constitution Square in Warsaw. And down there, another kind of objects are, let's say, like authentic places in pre-war buildings. Here it is the house where Havel was imprisoned before 1989. And a third kind of, let's say, group of objects or attractions are abandoned, gloomy, neglected, or destroyed places, liquidated factories, decaying monuments, broken water fountains, but also restaurants or pubs that had left behind the best years. I would like to turn to the latter now and to stay with these kind of neglected places and argue that the performative impact of neglected places goes beyond some kind of a ruin, romantics, or pure aesthetical enjoyment. On the one hand, such lost places of transition are used anachronistically to authenticate stories about the hardship of daily life during communism. For example, our visit in this rundown market hall in Bratislava implicitly served as evidence of what the guide had said before about the inefficiency of communist economy. Of course, this experiential notion is not only completely anachronistic, but also highly problematic. It goes unmentioned here that the people who go shopping and also drinking, actually, in this situation, today, these people are mostly those who actually did not benefit from the economic transformation. The locals thus become some kind of involuntary characters of a living history performance, not far from the voyeurism of slum or poverty tourism. On the other hand, many guides used neglected or destroyed places to explicitly comment on the problems of transition. In the same tour, the guide led us to this site to introduce the fate of the former brewery Stein, where his own father had worked. So this is also in Bratislava. Bought by foreign investors in the beginning of the 1990s, it had been shut down eventually. Also here in the former Matador tile factory, the guide talked about the rapid liquidation of many factories in Slovakia and the subsequent social problems: unemployment, homelessness, drug addiction, criminality. Later, he moved on to the nearby housing district Petržalka to talk about the first years of transformation and the emergence of no-go areas. And now I will finally quote from one of these tours. This is from Bratislava, the first quote. In the 1990s, I was afraid to go there, even during the daylight. But this was even more like whole Petržalka had quite bad reputation. And a similar dark picture is drawn by a free walking tour guide in Warsaw. In her introduction, she said, and I quote again, "I don't remember the communists, but I remember the transition. And those who think that from one day to another we became a happy country, a democratic country, they are totally wrong. 90s were mafia, 90s were pollution. German people, you know the joke. You are going to Poland for holidays, your car is already there. Those jokes started in the 90s, when actually Polish mafias were bringing cars from Germany." As we have seen in the quotations from these tours, the 1990s are portrayed as a time in which a sudden deregulation in different spheres of society led to huge social problems. However, this time is by no means addressed in a negative way only. On the contrary, it also shows up in a nostalgic way, as a period of personal freedom, of adventure, of childhood and youth. To understand what I mean, we have to take a closer look on the tour guides and tour operators who actually provide such communism tours. All major companies offering these guided tours about communism in Bratislava and Prague, but also Warsaw or Krakow, are run by local entrepreneurs born in the end of the 70s or the beginning of the 80s, and we already talked about this generation yesterday. Usually these people studied humanities, geographies, or art, sometimes even history. They sometimes graduated, sometimes they stopped their studies, and then they founded their private businesses around 10 till 15 years ago. The freelancing guides are sometimes a bit younger, but in general we also speak about this generation who experienced communism as children at the most. So in their talks, these children of transition draw on family, but also on childhood memories. The time of transformation in the 1990s coincided with the identity-shaping period of their socialization. And many guides talk about their first steps into Western consumerist society. For example, a Warsaw guide showed us the cinema in which he has seen Jurassic Park, or one talked about the Michael Jackson concert he had attended in the 90s, or where they bought their first Milka chocolate and things like that. But beside these consumption memories, many of my respondents addressed the 1990s as their coming of age in an unsettled, chaotic time. Petr, for example, one of the founders of the company Authentic Slovakia, told me how he and his friends were exploring the rapidly changing city in that time. And this is now from some interviews I conducted with this operator. I quote, "For drinking, we had the really cool places, like sitting on the pillars of the old bridge. Now it's hard to go there because there are new bars, but before it was easier. We just went on the ladder, and every Friday at 5, 6 p.m., we went there with a bottle of wine. Well, not every Friday. But when I was 17, 18, so in the 90s, it was one of the most popular places of Friday drink." And this is now the places he guides actually people to. Also, in other parts of our talk, Petr described Bratislava in the 1990s as a huge adventure playground with many shut-down factories, becoming spaces for gathering, drinking, and riding cars. In the end, it was exactly this fascination by the process of change which became the actual starting point for Petr's entry into the tour guiding business, as he told me in the same interview. I quote, "We decided to make something different. The thing of difference was the most important. Actually, first time we called this tour Changing Bratislava Tour, because we wanted to focus on how the modern development projects suddenly are there, destroying the abandoned factories. It was a little bit an urban exploring tour, and it still is." So obviously, the industrial wastelands are an integral part of the post-communist city tour because they are important to the guide. At the same time, he criticizes the increasing changes of his city due to unregulated investment politics. Sharing his personal feelings, he transfers the historical-themed guided tour into a tour about his personal biography. For the audiences of these alternative tours, these personal insights construct a feeling of existential authenticity, to use a term by by Kjell Olsen, who dealt with the social organization of the experience of authenticity in tourism. Olsen, in his article, argues that experiential authenticity is felt when travelers get the opportunity to alter their own role as a tourist. Here, in these Off the Beaten Path tour, they can feel as temporary friends of the guide. Together, the former factory crowns are gazed upon from a nostalgic point of view. The object of nostalgic longing is not the industrial past, however. It is the spirit of liberty experienced by the children of transition. At the same time, Petr does not regret the disappearance of an emotionally charged place only. He also observes how the material resource of his own commercial offer is demolished step by step, as he told me in the last quotation. With some people, we went also to this building, one of those factories, but now it's ruined. You know, they ruined the stuff of our tours. This last point touches upon a basic paradox of these tours. They share the critical notion about how the economic transformation took place and openly criticize international investment and the excesses of global capitalism. At the same time, the guides and operators are themselves successful entrepreneurs in tourism industry. They draw their profits from the interpretation of the post-communist cities with all their contradictions. This dialectic tension is solved in two ways. First, communism tours are marketed as offers beyond the ordinary mass touristic sphere, as I have argued. They are staged as alternative niches of tourism and as non-standardized offers which provide some kind of authentic gazes on the backstages of post-communist societies. To a great deal, they do so by a dialogical way of guiding in which the guides share personal stories and feelings. Second, these tours take the form of an ironic play with their own role in capitalism. In her analysis of the Crazy Guides performances in Krakow, I showed the picture in the beginning, Britta Tim Knudsen has called this strategy the capitalist framing of these tours. She shows how the guides openly commented the fact that they make a living out of the communist past by staging themselves as, and I quote her, the new symbolic workers of the new capitalist and democratic century in Poland. In regard of my case study, I would put it even more general. Communism tours are in many ways a self-ironic enactment of the basic dialectic of tourism, as Hans Magnus Enzensberger has described them in his famous essay already in 1958. He argued that the touristic yearning for the untouched, the pre-modern world, inevitably leads into tourism industry. Tourism industry, however, destroys exactly this untouchedness itself. By analogy, the time travel from capitalism to communism sold in these communism tours is possible only for those who can afford a private tour for at least 45 euros. Thank you.
So thank you for the presentation. The next speaker is Bartłomiej Krzysztan. He is assistant professor at the Institute of Political Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences. He just defended his PhD at the Political Science at the Institute of Political Science at the University of Wrocław. And his research interests include social and cultural memory, post-colonialism, ethnic and national identities, political anthropology in Poland and South Caucasus. The title of his presentation is Capitalism, Socialism in Post-Colonial Georgia, Post-Socialist Economic Reality and Structure of Memory on a Peripheral Flea Market.
Thank you very much, Bogdan, for the introduction. So first of all, thank you for your patience of being here so late at the very last day. And second of all, I just want to say that I'm really happy to be here back after 3 years, after first appearance, I guess in 2016, when I used to be then the PhD candidate still. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about part of my PhD dissertation, which is going to be published as a book soon, I guess. I hope, maybe that's the better word. And that's actually the part of the chapter, so it's not even the full chapter. The PhD basically in the book is dealing with the cultures of memory in South Caucasus, in the experiences of Georgia and Armenia in comparison, and Soviet past, post-socialist memories, usually the counter memories, because they are forgotten or neglected in the official discourse. They are quite of important part of the culture of memories in nowadays South Caucasus. So I'm going to use one of the ethnographic examples. This example is Flea market in capital city of Georgia, Tbilisi. And I'm using the example of Flea market because it's bringing into attention a few of the most important elements of post-socialist past in the nowadays cultural structure of the memory in Georgia. First of all, the flea markets, I think not only in the South Caucasus but all around the place, they are somehow representing the failed transformation. I don't remember who said that, but I was looking for this quotation yesterday and today. But one of the Polish politicians at the beginning of '90s said that the bazaars in the very city centers of the big cities in Central Eastern Europe is just a temporal solution for the capitalism which is rising, and probably in the perspective of 10 years. And he was saying that at the beginning of '90s, so he meant to the year 2000, they will disappear. As we can see, actually they didn't. What can be actually proving the failure of the transformation in this particular area. Second of all, as far as I'm trying to use post-colonial strategies and methods, set of tools to describe the culture of memory in this particular example of Georgia, the flea market somehow representing also the very difficult and disturbing memory of the past and the relation of nowadays country of Georgia with the former hegemonic power on a much more symbolic level than only the dependency which is based on the political or economic dependencies from the former empire. Doesn't matter whether we are talking about the USSR or we are talking about Russia. I'm going to get to this point later. Talking at the very last day had these advantages and disadvantages, and I don't know whether I should consider disadvantage that actually I don't have to really talk a lot about the theoretical background of the paper, because most of the things they were already said. So I suppose that I will skip this part to just get to the point and to describe the idea. I will just say just a few words, first of all, about like what are the paradigmatic requirements to implement these post-colonial theories to describe the space of the Georgia. First of all, periphery of former USSR, they relatively got rare post-colonial critique. And the analysis of this ethnographic example and other examples which I was analyzing when working on the book are showing that actually this critique is kind of necessary. Second of all, transition and transformation progressive modeling is kind of limiting the space. As I said, there is much higher and more important symbolic value of the such ethnographic examples, like for example, like flea market, that actually the usual model of progressing towards Western neoliberal model is not really, it's not fulfilling the necessity. And second of all, the post-imperial or post-colonial elements, they are really influential for the culture of memory in nowadays Georgia, first of all, because they are neglected. And this lack of references in the nowadays regime of truth, which was created after the Rose Revolution, it's also the kind of important sign that something is missing, and something what is missing is kind of the meaning. Theoretically, First of all, what I was trying to look at as an essence of the postcolonial studies, post-socialist space, is not how the heritage of dependency appears in the power structure, because it's quite well-researched area of the dependencies on the level of high politics, I would say, but rather how the narrative and visual representation of this post-coloniality in the not obvious representations, like, for example, flea market, are appearing. So the question which is still important, and I'm not sure whether I found an answer for that, is what is the relation between what we are calling the Sovietization and decolonization in post-socialist space? Because the term desovietization, or that something is Sovietized, is very often used, but very rarely we are theoretically thinking what we mean when we are using the term that something is desovietized or decolonized, because it's very easy to change the laws, very easy to change the structures, to change but very difficult to change the mentality and the way of thinking about the past. So it's my idea is to try to identify it as some kind of being stuck in the structure of captive minds, and I'm referring here to the very beginning of the postcolonial studies and ideas of decolonizing the minds as the final step of reducing the colonial dependency. Methodologically speaking, here you can see the part of the theoretical framework of my talk. But I think that the more important elements, we can back to the theory later during the question stage. But I will just tell you how I was researching the flea market itself. So I'm considering that as a part of political anthropology agenda. I was using the participant observation, so I visited this flea market several times. I was interviewing different groups of people there. First of all, I was interviewing the sellers, and second of all, I was interviewing also the buyers. And I was also but the most important element was the observations of the interactions between the sellers and the buyers. And also I was using some elements of the experimental ethnography. This ethnographic research for representations and references that reflect the theoretical and aesthetic assumptions about the colonial and post-colonial experiences in the post-socialist political space of Georgia. This ethnographic case was intended to prove that actually what left from socialists, some small leftovers and small remnants, they changed the symbolic value, being capitalized in different structures appearing after the collapse of the USSR. I was trying to recreate the mechanism of subordination of these Sovietized captive minds that have not yet undergone processes of decolonization. And this mechanism, they are usually stuck in three different elements. First of all is economic element of existing of flea market. Second element is the question of irony, which is twofold, or is dual irony. And the second element is, of course, the nostalgia for the previous time. Going into description. This is the beginning of this is one of the photos taken on this flea market. This is very important to realize where in the urban space the flea market itself is located. Tbilisi as a city is divided by the river, which has quite difficult Georgian name and has international name, but this is the name which was brought by the former colonizers. So in Georgian project of the memory, the using of the old Russian name Kura is absolutely forbidden somehow, but generally those who are visiting the city, they're unable to pronounce the Georgian name, which is Mtkvari, with this glottal sound somewhere in the middle, which is difficult to pronounce for anyone else who is not speaking the Kartvelian languages. And this river is separating the city into two parts. On the one part of the river, there is the most important representations of the Georgian stateness. So we get the institution of the Parliament, of National Georgian Museum. And the second part, it's the neighborhood which is called colonial area, which was built in the end of 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And irony of this fact is that actually this is the most visited touristically place in Tbilisi, and at the same time it's the remnant of the times from the late Russian Empire when the city was growing really strongly, but at the same time is going very against the idea of Georgian statehood nowadays, because the late 19th century in Georgia, in Tbilisi itself, there were living 90% of different nationalities and just percent of the Georgians. So this very location of the bazaar, it's somehow meaning. Second thing is that the question of place of bazaar itself in the political structure of Georgia. The word bazaar itself is coming from Persian, and it's used in Georgian. It came to Georgian from Persian, similarly like it came to English. But sometimes it's used also the Arabic word, which is also somehow proving the influence of the different imperial past, because sometimes there also the word souk or shuka, which is coming from Arabic, is used to describe. What is anecdotal somehow, it's also the short Georgian sentence which is like bazari ara, which means no problem, what basically literally means there is no bazaar. So somehow we can find some connections with looking on this from the political perspective. The bazaar itself, in such a country like Georgia, has two different meanings. Because first of all, is the place of economic exchange, but the second of all, it's very important politically because of the Persian past, Iranian past of the country itself. For the time being, political sellers, they got no such a political importance, like for example in Iran, but still the bazaar represents something which is lost already in Georgia. So for example, the experience of multilinguistic place. So when we are entering the bazaar, we can see first of all different examples of different layers of the bazaar itself. So first one, and probably the most important one, is the questions of the multicultural atmosphere, which kind of going again the project of the Georgian stateness nowadays, which is kind of based on the one nation idea. Second of all, there is a lot of semiotic references both to the Soviet times and to abruptness of changes which have happened after the collapse of the USSR. Then the bazaar is important because also they are representations of inefficiently implemented capitalist transformation in a Sovietized society that was completely unprepared for them in the early 90s, and this is this economic layer. And then bazaars are indicator of Georgian ambivalent cultural and geographical location. There's the institution of bazaar, like I said, in terms of significance and politics, is closest to the way this type of space exists in the tendentially conceived area of the Orient. So within the post-colonial studies, the Georgia can be researched through two different angles. First of all, the nation-building idea is pushing Georgia to the west, and the Georgians themselves are considering themselves as a part of the West. But on the other hand, for example, on these ethnographic examples and different ones which I was researching, they are like much more closer to what is considered traditionally as a part of the East or as the Orient. And the fourth element is the bazaar as the basic grassroots politics area, and this is what is the most visible when one is going through the bazaar. The next thing which I'm going to tell you, it's about how this bazaar operates. And now I'm going into the examples of different operational elements of the bazaar. So the first layer of the bazaar results from the economic necessity of its existence. This is the effect of structural exclusion, which in turn is a consequence of institutional and normative economic changes in the early 90s. This was of a significant importance for shaping the protocol of a capitalist set of unwritten rules that the bazaar follows. Observational studies and accounts from the interviews with sellers from the dry beach are underlying an interesting reason for the existence of the bazaar, also specifying its further duration. Many sellers has told that dry bridge began to develop as a place where better off Soviet citizens, what is important, like for example doctor, lawyers, academic staff, could sell their bourgeois and Soviet souvenirs to get funds to live in the civil war country at the beginning of 90s. Also, on the opposite side from the bazaar in park, which is called Dedena, which means exactly the mother tongue park, across the street there is traditional place where the sellers or renters or larger goods like cars or real estates gather. Initially, therefore, the better of citizens out of economic need used the bazaar for profit to get rid of items currently considered unnecessary and in the previous political region being a certain indicator of social status in a formally egalitarian society. So at the very beginning, the better of Soviet citizen, they were selling the remnants from the Tsarist Russia still and later the Soviet legacies as well to just get the money for living. So this is the economic necessity of its existence. Over time, the presence of these pre-revolutionary souvenirs was supplemented with souvenirs of socialism. The basic economic mechanism worked here, so more and more experienced sellers responded with the increased supply of post-socialist goods, for which, along with the increase in the number of tourists, more demand appeared. And then we are getting to the point of capitalization of Soviet goods, which is also connected with the irony of this capitalist space of post-socialist. Maybe I will explain you this irony and irrationality based on the two examples. The most important post-Soviet and post-communist memorabilia on the Flea market, there are those from the Second World War. And what is interesting, very often those remnants of the socialism, they are bought by the German tourists. And few sellers has told me during the interviews that actually they were reluctant at the very beginning to say that, but in the end they said that they're traveling to Germany to buy those remnants from the Second World War and then to sell it in the Tbilisi Flea market, saying that actually they were left by the German army when they was approaching the Caucasus. Second thing is that very often they are traveling to Russia, bringing the memories from the great memorabilia from Great Patriotic War from Russia. And then, for example, a number of Russian tourists are coming to former peripheral state and they're buying it because they're thinking that there are not enough of these things in home. And there is dual experience of irony in it because, first of all, ironically, those people who were living in the communist, who were not experiencing the socialism itself, they're using that as some kind of atypical souvenir from the post-socialist country. But on the other hand, those people who are coming from the countries which experienced socialism as the state political system, they are buying these remnants as a remembrance of the time which shouldn't be repeated. But there is also another element, which is nostalgia, which is visible in how the Flea market is operating. Because some of the sellers, especially those people who are selling at the bazaar for a long time, they're using their businesses as pawn shops. So in the 90s, they were buying the goods from the better off post-Soviet citizens and for the fixed price. And then they are selling this to some other customers and then buying it back. So then the people who were selling these goods, who are, for example, the family memory elements, they were coming back because they were like keeping their individual memories And then when they were like in the bad economic situation, they were coming back to the bazaar and selling it back to the seller, and the seller was keeping it for a while and then selling it back. And the price was growing up. So actually there is something more than only the economical value in it. And the last element is multilingualism, which I already mentioned, because this element of the bazaar is kind of counter-memory for the official state process, state politics of Georgia nowadays. Do I have 1 minute more to just say 2 words about the conclusion? So, as I said, the post-colonial experience of duality is based, first of all, on this bright clarification of the colonial center and the periphery, which is represented there. And the second of all, there is also the idea of provincialization of post-socialist memories, which is represented on the bazaar. Another element is the new regime of truth in the official policy, which bazaar is counter-representing. And the upper question, which is still, I think it's still open, is the question about does Sovietization equals decolonization? Because as far as being decolonized, it has much deeper meaning. On the other hand, we can say that the Sovietization, which is visible on this ethnographic example of bazaar, it's through the capitalizing processes already has been somehow achieved. Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, so our last speaker in the panel is Mykola Makhortykh. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research. He defended a PhD on digitization of war memory practices in Eastern Europe. He explores topics such as the instrumentalization of the past during the Ukraine crisis currently, and interactions between digital platforms and post-socialist nostalgia. The title of his paper is We Were Hungry, but We Were Also Free, Counter-Narratives of Russia's first post-Soviet decade on Instagram.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Bogdan. And also I'm going to join my previous 2 colleagues in thanking everyone for being too strong to actually stay there. I will do my best to actually prevent you from falling asleep with my terrible accent. So, indeed, as Bogdan noted, I'm going to talk today about the counter-narratives of the first Russia's post-Soviet decade on Instagram. And basically in my talk, I would like to specifically try to touch 3 major topics. The first one is the memory of the rowdy 90s, or as they pronounce in Russian, лихие 90-е in Russia. And today I really do not need to talk much about the socio-economic, political, and memory aspects of the 90s after this fantastic conference with so many inspiring talks. So I will just really briefly note that indeed memory of the 90s in Russia, similar to the Eastern and Central Europe, is a very complex amalgamation of term and nostalgia. And I would definitely refer to the fantastic volume by Berlin Neudenbos and Ksenia Robi, who was also here, where they pretty much discuss, among other topics, the very interesting effect that term and nostalgia has on the Russian culture. In the case of Russia, again, like in many other contexts, the 90s are associated on the one hand with economic, political, and also creative opportunities, but also disillusionment and losses, which also in the case of Russia is pretty much voiced by this post-imperial nostalgia and post-imperial trauma experiences, specifically in this time of last century. However, what is also interesting about the memory of the 90s nowadays, it is these memories are pretty intensively also instrumentalized by Kremlin to emphasize the danger of the transformation, which, as Mr. Putin recently noted, leads to the tragic years similar to the one experienced in the 90s when Russia was on the edge of losing its sovereignty. So basically for the Kremlin, the memory of the 90s is very convenient in this very simple binary structure. So when you think about revolution, when you think about transformation, when you think about change, immediately thinking about the 90s when we were hungry, when we were suffering, and when the West tried to dominate us. That's why you do not really want revolution, and you don't really want change, and you should be perfectly fine with Mr. Putin sitting there for the next several terms. However, what is also interesting is that this binary construct that is pretty much constructed by the Kremlin also fuels a different form of use of the memory of the 90s. And in this case, 90s are presented as some kind of the alternative, in many senses a voice alternative to the current very much authoritarian situation in the Russia. And in this case, the memory of the 90s serves as a counter-narrative which contrasts the current situation with memories of the freedom, both in terms of economy and also in terms of the politics. So it is the first thing I would like to talk today. The second subject I would like again to touch today is the role of digital media in all those complexities related to the memory in Russia and in the region. So indeed, the intense monopolization that we observe in the Russia pretty much limits possibilities for the ordinary citizens to actually influence the representation of the past in the public sphere. And what happens in this case is that ordinary citizens go online. And specifically, they go online to the digital media, specifically to the Western social media platforms, because those platforms are significantly less subject to the state censorship, which is an increasingly big thing in the Russian internet. And those platforms become an important means of cultural and political self-expression. And those cultural and political self-expression pretty often also deal with the past. And in the case of the past, what we see in the Russian internet is that we have increasing number of the digital media for challenging hegemonic narratives of the past and promoting alternative interpretations. Or at least we can find this interpretation in another wonderful book by Rutenförder and Zverev from 2013. And now the third thing that I'm going to talk today is specifically Instagram, which is one of those interesting Western digital media platforms. And here I have a first question for you. Who anyone here is actually using Instagram? Can you raise your hand? Okay, I see some brave hands in the back, which is already good. So at least some people here know what Instagram is. So just to specify it, Instagram is really a major international photo and video sharing platform where you can pretty easily, or at least relatively easily, upload photo and video materials and then share it with your friends, or actually try to publish it to the wider audience. What is really interesting in the case of Instagram is that it is really the second most popular social networking website. In Russia, it is second only after Kontakte, so it's significantly more popular than, for instance, Facebook, which is kind of counterintuitive for a lot of Western users. In the case of Instagram, we have quite some platform affordances or platform functionalities which basically enable users to store, share, and also interact in terms of comments. Recently, it also allowed you to use like. I think that recently they stopped this one. And basically, users are able to do all those wonderful things with different forms of audio-visual content, including memory-related one. And because of these reasons, Instagram actually served as a platform for several online campaigns related to the 90s, which were referred to as memory marathons. And my initial idea in the paper was to actually specifically look on those memory campaigns, but then I decided that, okay, it might not necessarily be very representative, because very often those campaigns are really run by a few people who have their own specific agendas. So I decided to actually try to look on the wider, on the broader corpus of materials on Instagram related to the 90s. And by doing so, I'm trying to answer three major research questions. The first one is how post-1991 socioeconomic transformation in Russia presented and interpreted via Instagram. What are the recurring visual tropes used by Instagram users to communicate nostalgia and trauma related to this transition period? And finally, to what degree Instagram actually serves as a platform for counter-narrating the 90s, or it actually does not serve as this. So I will start by briefly going into the theoretical background that I'm going to use. And indeed, my starting point is this notion of the digital memory return that quite some people here are familiar with. So we have this idea that the growing use of the digital media has very significant implications for the way we remember the past, both individually and collectively, specifically because it allows us significantly easier to construct artifacts of the past and construct narratives of the past online. And then we're actually able to much easier and faster interact and also counteract those narratives via the platform affordances. It also has significant implications for the trauma and nostalgia. And here I defined those two terms relatively simplistically. I'm here relying on the definition by Leck from 2004, who actually argues that trauma and nostalgia are two very closely related terms, that both of those terms actually relate to the reactivation of the past, when the past actually intrudes to the present and activates strong emotional connections to the present. In the case of nostalgia, I classify it as a positive relationship to the present. In the case of trauma, I I view it as a negative connection to the past. And in the case of this digital turn and nostalgia and trauma, we have pretty divergent ideas about the implications of these two. One of the ideas is that indeed the turn to digital media as a main platform for the memory making and memory interaction facilitates bonding over trauma and nostalgia. It also helps to deal with collective individual silence, which is a major problem of collective and individual trauma. However, what it can also potentially do is to increase possibility of accidental rediscovery. So for instance, when I'm going to Instagram, I often do not control immediately what I'm going to see because algorithms actually make my very nice recommendation list and also my newsfeed in the case of Facebook. And then I can easily interact and find something that actually activates a trauma in my hand. And there is a possibility that actually leads to the re-traumatization. It's also in the case of the transformations related to the 90s. However, how it actually works in the case of the 90s? And it is really a wonderful question because for now we pretty much do not know how it works. So there are two major reasons why we still do not know. First of all, the most of research in the Russian context is very much still focused on the post-Soviet nostalgia, for the nostalgia for the Soviet Union. Whereas in the case of post-Soviet memories, the memories of the 90s, we still do not have that much research done yet. Moreover, the existing research on this fascinating post-Soviet time is very much focused on analog media, such as literature, such as theater, and also analog contexts and not the digital ones. We also have another problem, which is related to the overall assessment of the digital turn that I noted about. And here the problem is that it's still very much ambiguous. We're still not sure how exactly the digital changes affect our individual and collective remembrance. There is fascinating idea of Anna Makhortykh that indeed the digital media can melt what she called the frozen currents of memory, the frozen traumas in the society, and actually help us to deal with those traumas, help us to process those traumas, and eventually lead to the more pluralistic public memory sphere. However, and it is something that I also found in my research and what you can also find in a fascinating book by Lisa Kaufman, that in the case of Russia specifically, we very often find a totally different effect of the digital media on memory. We actually find that digital media facilitates the instrumentalization of the memory to stigmatize opponents, to actually present something in the past as a threat in the present, and specifically the case of the Ukraine crisis, which is still going on. Now, how I'm actually trying to understand those effects in the case of Instagram and the memory of the 90s. So in order to conduct my study, I started by actually identifying the hashtag, which I used to collect data on the Instagram, and I ran quite some queries. I tried different terms, and eventually I ended up with the hashtag 90 or the 90s, which was really one of the most representative and interesting in terms of the data collected, but of course it's definitely not a comprehensive one. It's just one term that was used to collect the data. Eventually, I collected 10,200 posts with this hashtag, which I coded using Phantom Buster automated programming interface, and I collected data from 2012 to 2019. And for this particular talk, I'm going to talk about the random sample of 200 posts, which I collected with equal distribution of posts per year, with an exception of 2012, when we have very, very little posts for this specific time. In order to analyze this data, I used close reading of sample posts with a subsequent coding using inductive coding approach. And I specifically was interested in three major coding schemas. First of all, I was interested in effective attachment to the path that is included in the post. And specifically here, I tried to understand whether or not the 90s referred in the positive, negative, or non-affective way. Then I was also interested in the use of the specific mnemonic function. So what's the assumed mnemonic function the specific post was serving, and I will definitely talk about this in the findings. And then I was also looking on the objects of memory, so around which objects the references are centered, which memory object actually is the center for the representation of the 90s on the Instagram. And now let's look on some funny graphs. So first of all, we can have a look on the general use of the 90s hashtag on the Instagram. And what we find here is, surprise, surprise, it is growing. It is also should be taken with some grain of salt, because basically one of the tricks of the social media data in Instagram too is that you kind of losing the data from the early years. So the most representative samples are the ones which are related to the most recent time. However, I would really doubt that the dynamics would change. So in general, we definitely have an increase of the use of the Instagram of the 90s hashtag on the Instagram. Why we have this specific timing? Why we have this specific increases and this specific dynamics? Personally, you can think about two possible explanations. First of all, and probably the major explanation, that the generation which was actually born in the 90s, generation of the 90s, rises to the maturity around this time. And then they eventually rediscover and discover the social media platform. And now 90s is their nostalgic moment, is their childhood, it is their teenage time, and they're actually nostalgic about this time. They want to share this nostalgia. However, there is one more socio-economic and also political factor, because actually I would argue that in 2014 and later on we have some dramatic changes in the Russian public sphere. And those changes are pretty much related to the increase of authoritarian tendencies, a growing confrontation with the West. And I would actually argue that indeed in this case we again have this activation of the 90s as a counter-narrative. The time when we were not clashing with the West that high, the time when we had some kind of democracy which is very different from what we are having now, and it also contributes to our nostalgia towards this time. Then what I actually look to is the distribution of affective sentiment related to the past. And what we found here, which is pretty interesting, is that pretty much the positive perception of the 90s is pretty much dominant throughout the whole period. There is really relatively little content which deals with the trauma, and I found it really fascinating because a lot of talks during the conference were talking about trauma, and a very valid reason. It wasn't a very traumatic time, but in the case of Instagram, we really do not observe that much trauma anymore. And then what I was actually doing is I was looking on what I called the 6 shades of nostalgia and trauma, unfortunately not 50, but maybe also for the best. And here I was actually trying indeed to conceptualize those different functions that content on the Instagram serves. And I would start with the abstract nostalgia, which is described in the orange color, and you see it's relatively stable throughout the period of observation. So what we see in the case of the abstract nostalgia, what I call abstract nostalgia, is a general references to the past without specific 90s-related mnemonic indicators. And here are some examples. So basically you have those 2 very nice, very family images with nice descriptions such as it doesn't matter that you are poor, but you have a soul and you have a brother, #90s. And the tricky thing here is that, at least in my understanding, you can easily replace the #90s with the #80s or the #2000, and it really would not change much what you see on the screen. Because what we see on the screen is very general reference to the time when we were children, to the time when we were teenagers, to the time when we were young. And there is really not much that actually connects you to the 90s in this case. So indeed, in the case of the abstract nostalgia, we have very human-centric nostalgia about the abstract childhood or teenage memories with special emphasis on the personal relationships. So here we're specifically nostalgic about the people we loved, the people we meet earlier. And here I would actually argue that Instagram serves a digital public/private photo album, which used to store your personal recollection. So here it really doesn't have too much to do about economy, about politics, about anything else. It's really about our childhood and about teenage years. In the case of specific nostalgia, which is really very dominant in the first period from 2012 to 2015 and then slightly declines, we have something different. We have a strong focus on specific material cultural elements of the 90s which serve as a distinct mnemonic indicators. And here are some fascinating examples. To the right, you actually see a video record from the concert by Yuri Shatunov, a famous Russian singer in the 90s. Anyone here actually knows Shatunov? You know, it's actually for the better, believe me, because it's really honestly one of the voice popular music groups in Russia in the 90s, but it's extremely popular. It's really the symbol of the 90s in the pop culture. And to the right, you have one of the popular Russian games of the period, and the description says, I found a sack of tokens at the parents' house. I will even remember some of them. Which one did you have? And as you see, it's really very different functions that those images play. So also very different connection to the past. And what we actually find here is we have a very item-centric nostalgia. An item here can be a cultural product, it can be a material item, which is related to earning for specific practices or products or items, and which those things generally evoke with very positive memories about the time. And here I would actually argue that Instagram serves a different function compared with the abstract nostalgia. Here Instagram is actually some kind of digital memorabilia storage which is used to reactivate individual memories and forge relationships with other members of those memory communities. Thank you, Bogdan. And basically here we indeed have a lot of different interactions, like, do you remember those stories? Do you remember this music? Let's discuss this music. Let's activate our past. In the case of commercialized nostalgia, the third type, We have again increase in 2006 and 2017, and again it's very much something that is focused on the material and cultural elements of the 90s, which again serve as distinct indicators. But the function here and the eventual goal here is very different. Here are two examples. Like in the, again, left, you have a fascinating advertisement for the musical evening, which reads the following: "Take me fast, take me beyond 100C, and kiss me everywhere, I'm already 18. If you didn't just read the line above, but sing it, hopefully I didn't sing it, and your soul is filled with a pleasant nostalgia, and get your jinx and legging out of your wardrobes, the 90s are coming back to the floor 41. So indeed, what we are having here is very instrumental use of the past for promoting specific products or targeting specific audience to sell something, to advertise something. And here we actually have Instagram used as a platform for selling cultural or material products with a taste of memory. I think that I would actually probably go through the showcasing very fast. So basically the idea of the showcasing is that indeed you're using Instagram as some kind of the digital museum. You're basically just publishing some artifacts related to the past, like those awful UP juices from the 90s, actually some kind of the techniques, but you do not attach any emotional relationship to it. It can be really guessed to some idea, but you really cannot read what kind of emotion the person who published it has. And here indeed Instagram works as some kind of digital museum where those artifacts are showcased and shared with the audience. And one more interesting example is referencing, which is kind of similar to the commercialist nostalgia, but here we're actually having the use of those references to the past in a creative way. And here, for instance, you have youngsters who basically were as the bandits from the 90s in order to provide some kind of periodic reference to the 90s, both in reference to their own personal life, but also in the reference to the current reality. Like, things didn't really change that much. We still can wear those clothes like gopniks from the 90s. And here I would actually argue that Instagram serves as a platform, as a place for remixing of the past. The last part that I will talk and then I will jump to the conclusions is trauma. And in the case of trauma, there are some interesting things. First of all, as I told, there's really very little trauma in general. And when we actually found something related to the trauma, it's represented in a very uniform way. It's usually represented as white and black photos, so like it's really very contrast with very colorful images of other mnemonic functions that are found. And here we actually find some very personal references, and here we actually find some economic references, specifically to the economic hardship experience in this time. And what is interesting here is that indeed Instagram here serves as some kind of platform for sharing the hidden pain, for sharing the personal trauma, but it also has very strong aspect of pride for overcoming it. So now I'm going to slide through those. If you would be interested in what kind of mnemonic objects we use, just ask me during Q&A, and I'm going to my conclusions. So what Instagram does not, what actually I found in terms of my initial idea of Instagram serving as a place for the counter-narrative. What I found that indeed Instagram does not tell much directly about economy and politics. You're basically not able to find much about economy and politics. You might find some very vague reference to the poor economic situation. You can find one video about Boris Nemtsov, but that's it. Instagram is not about economy or politics in the context of the 90s. Indeed, its public section is also not about trauma, and I'm talking about the public section because it's the ones where we're able to get data. There are also private Instagram posts, private Instagram communities. Maybe there is more trauma here, but we do not know. It also does not offer a coherent counter-narrative of the 90s in a traditional socio-economic political sense, so Mr. Putin should not really worry that much about Instagram. It really doesn't challenge the traditional narrative that much, but indeed it provides a different narrative from the one that is promoted by the authorities in Russia. It really doesn't tell you that the 90s were a terrible time when we were slaves of the West and when there was only despair and suffering, but it really shows it in a different way. In which way it shows it? It actually shows us in a very nostalgic way. Instagram definitely shows us different forms of nostalgia which arise online and allows us to understand how nostalgic communities bond together. It also shows very strong fascination with the 90s that counters a state-sponsored narrative to a certain degree, but also potentially obfuscates traumatic experience. Because if everyone is posting something nice about 90s, I'm really eager to post something different, especially if your friends are posting it. And then it also highlights the possibilities to construct the past online which in the case of my study lead to the prevalence of very positive aspects and high visibility of objects related to the personal life and culture. And finally, it also raises a question about the effect of platform-specific practice for representation of the past, because I definitely think that we should talk more also in comparative sense about different platforms and memories that arise about them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for 3 wonderful papers. I think that this last panel proposes a refreshingly social anthropological take on memory, on both state socialism and the transformation period, emphasizing the layeredness and the multimodality of narratives about the recent past articulated by actors that are outside of power articulation. We get in this way a kaleidoscopic view of mnemonic representations about late socialism in 1990s in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space. And I got the impression that all these 3 papers kind of refer to this idea of mnemonic self-determination at the individual level, kind of part of the larger story of recuperating Eastness, which is appetizingly slippery as it simultaneously relates to socialism, Sovietness, capitalism, transition, Westernness, and so on and so forth. So this brings me back to the issue of liminality and how the in-betweenness of former socialist spaces reflect itself into individual memories of both the past and the transition period. What it's very nice in the 3 papers is the fact that irony and self-irony come into the picture as a way to negotiate these multiple frameworks of representing the self in relation with the past, while also opening a way to the past commercialization. And here, interestingly, capitalism itself is hybridized, adapted to fit and sustain the ambiguity of mnemonic practices. It is not a resource for breaking with the past as we would expect. On the contrary, it is a way of keeping it alive, meaningful, and last but not least, profitable. Sabine, you talk about the Western gaze that alters the representations of the past by actors from Eastern Europe. Isn't it also an issue here of self-colonizing gaze among the organizers of the guided tours? At the same time, one element that I was wondering about when I was reading your paper is the mutual influence across Eastern Europe in terms of the success of trailblazers in the guided tour industry that then act as a model for others. For maybe there is a sort of regional imitation game, if you ever run into this issue or not. Mykola and Bartłomiej, you also talk about this broader Soviet space in your papers. So I think one could also emphasize more the impact of mnemonic practices because of circulations within the Soviet space, a specificity that itself affects frameworks of references. So generally speaking, I would just put together the 3 papers into a more general remark. I would like to emphasize the importance of looking at entanglements not only on the east-west axis, but also looking at circulation, mobility, transfer within former socialist spaces in memory representations. Bartłomiej, it's intriguing that you're putting together this idea of decolonizing the mind with Miloš's captive mind, but at the same time, as a historian, I'm a bit reluctant about the conceptualization, because it seems a bit essentializing. Strategies of belief, survival, or resistance vary very widely within socialist societies, and how do you evaluate if these people were captive or not, and who's evaluating the captiveness of individual minds, and who's liberating them of their captivity? It's a bit of a colonizing conceptual framework itself. When you're talking about post-coloniality in the former Soviet space, and especially in Georgia, I wonder the participatory and co-production of Soviet rule itself, rooted in affirmative action policies during the Soviet Union toward individual republics or Soviet nationalities. How does that complicate or play into your conceptualization of post-coloniality for the Soviet space? And Mykola, I was thinking about the, we were talking earlier, Adam Mrozovsky mentioned this idea of living on the margins of history. And I was wondering whether the way people use social media to engage with memory, can it be described as reconstructing a memory milieu that allows them to exit from official mnemonic regime without particularly pursuing opposition? Is basically kind of regaining autonomy, basically, denied by official memory. And if you can say a few more words about the use of memories of the 90s for today, because you're saying that maybe more should be said by that. And last but not least, Mykola has this phenomenal part in his paper about turbo chewing gums, which are re-commercialized on Instagram, and I grew up with turbo chewing gums. They're very precious when I was little, and so I was wondering, very importantly, how the hell do they still have a stock of turbo chewing gum, and is it still good? If you want to respond, and then we'll get a round of questions.
Okay. Shall I start, or?
Yeah.
Okay. So regarding your first question about self-colonizing gaze, of course, definitely. I would say, I would not call it self-colonizing gaze, but more like a self-orientalizing or self-exotizing. And this is quite interesting because this is something scholars of anthropology have dealt with a lot in tourism anthropology regarding ethnic tourism, but more or less for tourism to Africa, to Asia, and I think, but we can probably we can actually use these concepts here. So maybe I don't have to elaborate more on this because definitely it's like this. I'm not sure if I really understood you also acoustically, your last question. It was about the mutual influence of the different offers between Berlin, let's say, and Moscow.
Yeah.
Yes, I would say in Poland we have those crazy guys, which are definitely a role model, and they are really equal what they are presenting. But I was in my case studies in Bratislava, in Prague, and in Warsaw, I was asking them whom they do knew, and they often know their colleagues in the other countries, but they don't go on these tours. I don't know if they are afraid of then copying them, and I don't know if it's I don't know what's the reason.
To preserve authenticity.
But anyway, I would say, of course, there's a highly mutual influence from the side of the tourists, because they are very often visiting the different offers in the different countries. There's a lot of people going to communist tours in this country, and this country, and this country, and then these imaginaries are coming together from this side and via popular media. So these stories told are very universal. This is more stories about kind of an Eastern Bloc. It's not national stories for, let's say, 90% they are presenting. This is more, differences are more, you can trace them in regard to urban space, much more than in regard to national differences. And so I would say popular media culture, films, but also media like TripAdvisor, they are much more contributing to this universal story than, like, let's say, some mutual influence from one operator or one guide to another. Sorry.
Okay, so maybe I will start with this idea of evaluating of captiveness. So basically, I would say that it's just figure of speech, I would say. I'm as far as you were reading the articles, you know that there is this juxtaposing of the post-colonial idea of decolonizing mind and decaptivating from the captive mind, let's say. So I'm using that as a figure of speech in the mirror that actually this is kind of ideal type, which will never be achieved because the moment when you're starting to believing that the mind is decolonized, then or the post-socialist or post-Soviet mind is no longer captive, it's still based on the imagination of how it was before, and the moment how it was before, it cannot be reconstructed back because there is too much of elements which influence the individual situation during the time when it was under the dependency. And then the affirmative actions from the Soviet time, you mean like, for example, Koreanizacja and this kind of process?
Stuff like that, stuff that, yeah, exactly. The policies that developed out of the Koreanizacja trend, and of course, if you take just like not the entire Soviet period, it reflects this type of affirmative action policies, but there are periods, and especially in the 1980s, it's hard to talk about, Georgia being colonized by the Soviet Union when you have a Minister of Foreign Affairs of Georgian origin. So.
Oh well, okay. So how I can? So first of all, there is. You are absolutely right, because the first of all, the experience of coloniality within Georgia and Armenia and these states which were established after the collapse of USSR is slightly different than, for example, in Central Asia or those places which didn't have the experience of stateness, for example, before, because both the nation was quite well constructed before the Soviet Union took over Georgia in Armenia. So I suppose that like these affirmative actions like Koreanizacja from 20s, they didn't really influence this political space. But on the other hand, and this is just the conclusions from my broader research within the PhD, is that actually, especially 30s, in the change of the Soviet constitution, the change of the borders within South Caucasus, giving different status to Abkhazia, moving Nagorno-Karabakh from the Armenian influence into Azerbaijan, etc. Very often it's considered as a moment when actually some hegemonic power which has nothing in common with the South Caucasus starting to changing the circumstances, and the consequences are visible still today. So the wars from the 90s, it was the consequences of moving the borders and so on. And if you brought already up the case of Shevardnadze, it's just like this is the person of the very, I wouldn't say that very black and white evaluation nowadays in Georgia, but on the other hand, he's the perfect example of this comprador personality. Because being the ethnic Georgian, he was representing what is considered and used to be considered already in the 80s as the external representations of the external power. And actually, very good comparison of Shevardnadze can be done with the nowadays president of the country, who is French-born Georgian from the family of white Georgians who escaped from Georgia at the beginning of 20s, and she's speaking better in French than in Georgian, and a lot of Georgians they're blaming her of not being like fully Georgian. And the same case with Shevardnadze. Maybe Shevardnadze was not making the mistakes in Georgian like she does, but still he's this like very, very good explanation of this comprador personality. Yeah, so I think that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the great questions, Bogdan. So I will start from the most important one, about the chewing gum. I would say that, honestly, I would not try it. There are also quite some doubts expressed by the users who actually interacted with this Instagram page. So I kind of assume that here we might go into the domain of memory falsifications, when you're actually using very instrumentally something to sell the product that is actually not totally the kind of chewing gum you remember, but you're still trying to sell it. Considering the two other great questions, the memory autonomy and the use of social media and digital media in general as memory autonomy, I would totally agree, yes. I would actually agree that it is really interesting phenomenon that we also touched in our previous research when we actually were thinking about filter bubbles phenomenon, which I'm pretty much sure a lot of people here are familiar with. And I would say that in the case of Russia and also other countries with very strong hegemonic narratives of the past, which actually very strongly reinforced in the public sphere by the state, digital media can actually serve as some kind of memory filter bubbles. And indeed, it is not that good on one side, because filter bubbles are not very good for your integration into the public sphere, but at the same time, they give you autonomy. And in this autonomous space, you indeed can try to forge some kind of alternative narratives, which alternatively you wouldn't be simply able to forge. And in the case of the users of the past, I would say it would be really very hard to count all the possible users of the past, because the memory is used so differently, not only on Instagram, but on also other social media platforms. You can really find so many users starting with commercialization, which I mentioned, and ending, with trying to deal with this digital loneliness, when you indeed just simply publishing something with a hashtag 90s and asking, okay, does anyone remember this? Because I want to meet people who remember this in the way I remember this. And here you indeed have this phenomenon of bonding based on the memories. And of course, it is pretty traditional uses of digital archives, digital museums, simply to store your remembrance, to store those artifacts, and then reinvigorate your memories later on.
Okay, we can gather some questions. One, where's the, there?
Thank you for your papers. I have a question to Mykola about collective memory in your studies. I wonder how does it work in your case? I would say that the concept of collective memory and memory studies have been developing based on the classic models of communication. Am I in the wrong place or something? I can move? Okay. This were developed based on classic models of communication. There's supposed to be some act, of meeting, discussion, agreement, negotiations, and so on. And I have a feeling we probably have tried to have some discussion on Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And it doesn't work. It's more like, individuals, they just call what they want to say, and that's it. And there is no discussion. So I have a feeling it's kind of a broken collective memory process. It's not full. It's only some kind of. So I wonder whether it's the collective memory concept really can be applied to the Facebook or Twitter discussions. And maybe that's the reason why you couldn't trace, issues about politics. For example, because politics is something very public. It needs community, collectivity. And, maybe it's not possible at Facebook. Thank you.
Next, Joanna, or who's,
Thank you so much for the wonderful papers. I also have a question to Bartłomiej, also about this decolonization, desovietization thing. So I was like, with desovietization, I don't have like an issue, but with decolonization, I think that the recent theories of decolonization, they do use the term decolonization not as like simply getting rid of a colonizer, but more like, this is that you have many hybrid identities. And then there is the reemergence of new identities. And this is where like scholars like Walter Mignolo or Madina Tlostanova, who studies with him exactly the Caucasus, they try to show these fuzzy forms and the reemergence of new forms and not just getting rid of the enemy, right?
any other question? Oh, there, sorry, Veronica.
Yeah. I have two very short anecdotes, if I may, and a question to Sabine. So my mother is a tour guide in Prague. She doesn't do communism tours. She's not of that generation. But when she does have mainly American tourists ask her about communism, she gets very frustrated that, often they'll say things like, wait, so you actually like had stuff to eat? And they kind of want to hear the story of suffering, and then like when she kind of denies that, then they're a bit disappointed. So I'm not at all surprised that in these transition tours, there's this focus on this kind of like ruinology, right? On kind of this destitution. It kind of completely makes sense as kind of what these tourists actually want to see. And then the other thing is that you mentioned museums at the beginning of your talk, and I don't know if you've also conducted research on those, but I did some research on the Prague Museum of Communism. And I interviewed the founder, and this is kind of a very interesting episode because this is a Canadian guy who came to Prague at the beginning of the 90s as an entrepreneur, and he decided to set up a restaurant business, which quickly grew. And he started collecting socialist era artifacts as decorations for his restaurants. And then he found out that he had amassed such a number of these that he thought, oh, I'll just open a museum. And that's what he did. And so obviously the kind of aims behind this museum were, purely commercial, and there's, like zero historical knowledge really. I mean, he did obviously hire some people with some kind of historical training, but not very much, to be honest. So I was just wondering, I mean, in the Czech Republic, there is no official state-sponsored museum of communism. I don't know what the situation is in Warsaw or Bratislava, but I suspect it's similar. Just, do you have some thoughts also kind of on how, what are the narratives kind of that result from this kind of commercialization also of museums of this era for tourists? Like, what is the kind of presentation there?
Okay, Joanna, and then we'll answer some questions. Then we'll take another round if we have time.
Yeah, I really like this panel. This is terrific. I have a similar just question for Sabine. So I went at the hotel. They have like a brochure that gives you like all the tour. Like you take different walking tours, and it was just like a brochure that they give out. And so I took the communism tour, and it became almost impossible to continue because I mean, the word I can't think of another word to explain it. To me, it was snarky. I don't know if that word comes across to people, but to snarky, it would seem to be kind of have this sort of outrage about like things that were just not really outrageous. Like they use the same bricks they used before communism. Isn't that outrageous? Like so these sort of like this outrageousness didn't work. So I was wondering if the tours that you see that there's a little negotiation going on or between the tour guide and the tourist, figuring out what level of snarkiness or other kinds of things they can do, right? That they don't know what's going to work for them.
Okay, Sabine?
Oh, I should start again? Okay. Okay, maybe just starting with the last question or comment. Thank you for going to a walking tour, and thank you for the question. Actually, those walking tours, I would say they work very differently from those I was more or less presenting today, riding a car, retro car, is really different from doing a walking tour. This is part of my research to also differentiate between the different modes of moving, because they really, really impact on the way history is presented in a way. But coming back to this more like discursive or narratives, of course, this is all about negotiation. And the interesting thing is a tour always starts the same way, and probably you will confirm this, that the guide is waiting for people gathering, and then he will ask people where they are coming from. This is part of a normal touristic encounter. You always ask, where are you from? How long have you been traveling? But this asking where people are from is really part of the touristic part of the tour. And this is also what these tour guides in my interviews are telling me. It's really important for the tour because I have to check out where the people are coming from and what their backgrounds are. And especially in my own case, I'm coming from Germany, and they will always ask me after knowing I'm from Germany, East or West, because then they will categorize if there is someone with a Eastern background in the tour, and then they very often use this knowledge of sometimes there is one Polish people, one Czech people, one Czech person, one German person or East German person, and they will use this knowledge while touring the city to authenticate what they are saying. They are very often they are approaching me or another person in the tour, asking, "Do you have the same experiences?" And so this is why I'm really interested not in reading the scripts of the tours only, but in this interaction, because this is actually what is my research interest on, and how history is authenticated in these tours. And so it's really a lot about negotiating history, not only in terms of popular images, but also really in this basic sense of the word. So just as one aspect of your question, maybe. And yeah, the museums, I don't really care about museums, only if they are part of my tours, because I really like to stay with these guided tours, because I think it's really a very special medium of a spatial-based talking while walking, let's say. So I'm only interested in how these guides are approaching the space of the museum. And yeah, it's interesting that we don't have any state-driven or communal like museum. I know that in Prague there is now an initiative for having such a museum. And interestingly, when I took my last tour in Bratislava, this guide, she told me that her main motivation to do these tours is the lack of a museum. She's doing those tours because tourists do not have a chance to learn something about the communist past if they don't take a tour. So I think it's really interconnected, this issue. And when it comes to how they integrate the museums into their tours, then actually this is the space where daily life is reflected more upon, because for example in Warsaw you will more talk about let's say political history, about architecture in the open space, and then you will have a very different kind of narrating in those closed space of the museum. And what is really interesting for me is in Prague you have a lot of private museums in those shelters, in the bunkers. There's some below Parukaczka Park in Žižkov. You have one downstairs in the Yalta Hotel on Wenceslav Square. And those little private museums, really strange collections of memorabilia, like souvenirs and old posters, propaganda posters, and daily life items and things belonging to the shelter originally, and so on. This is really, I could talk very long about this topic, because in my opinion, they give a really, let's say, special space of this history negotiation, because here, like far from the public space, different things are sayable, and this is really striking. How this mode of talking really changes in the moment of descending into a bunker, for example, or sometimes also when going into one of these museums, which sometimes are really, there's sometimes nobody inside, and just the tour group is inside. So it's also a question about political correctness a bit, and about, maybe, I don't know if I answered. Yeah.
Okay, so I will try to, because this was more like a comment than like a question. So yeah, I absolutely agree. It's just one of the ways of maybe not creating the new identity, but to consolidate it. It's and this way of escaping from this hybridity, and this new regime is like based on totalness, I would say. So that's only the question of removing all of the post-socialist remnants from the public space, but it's also based on the education. So, for example, educational project, which was brought right after, it was one of the first projects implemented after the Rose Revolution, and it already got fruits, I would say, because this
decolonizing of mind or like the captivating of a mind. It's visible in the new generations which was going through the educational process after 2004. So those spaces like this Flea market on one of the museums, which is in Tbilisi, which is at the same time the headquarters of the Communist Party, and it's partly referring to your question. It's just this counter memory, which is somehow marginal and it's excluded. And if I may, because the question was to Sabine, but I was researching the communist museums in different places. So I can give you the example from Georgia, of course. So there is also anecdotal somehow. There is something which is called Museum of Soviet Occupation, and it's a part of the Museum of Georgia National Museum. And actually it's on the 4th floor, so it's occupying just one floor of the Georgian National Museum. And what's interesting, the Museum of Soviet Occupation, which is like absolutely going together with the new identity project. So it's not showing any signs of positivity about the past. It's exactly in the same rooms where earlier it was the Museum of Socialist Georgia and Russian Revolution in Georgia. And I was interviewing one of the historians who was responsible for this exhibition, and he told me about that, and I asked him, like, where are those things which were exhibited here before? And he said, like, yeah, we got a special magazine, we kept them there because we don't know what will happen tomorrow, so maybe the narrative will change again, so then we'll bring it back, and this we will move back to the magazine. So this is how it works. And from Central Europe, I don't know whether this is this kind of museum, but there is a Terroraza in Budapest, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for the brilliant question, Andrzej. I really love this one a lot. I would also say that it's a very complex one because the integration of the classical collective memory or cultural memory theory with digital media is a very tough task, I would say. There is really so many spears broken, so many books and articles written. If you would ask my opinion, I would say that in my opinion, the end result of the collective memory is pretty much broken by the digital media. But the general idea of the process is not necessarily should be discarded, but just adapted. Because if you actually look on how, let's say, memory of the 90s is working on Instagram, the idea is still pretty much the same. We interact with each other in order to form the narrative, and then based on the results of this interaction, a certain narrative is established and then distributed. But the way of interaction really changes dramatically, and specifically probably the main change is fragmentation, because first of all, we really start interacting in much more fragmented ways with those, shards of memory. And indeed, the way of interacting also changes, because earlier it would be classical debate between individuals, but now you basically do not need this step in order to produce the narrative, because you can simply write a post on the Instagram, which becomes your narrative, and you can publish it in this hybrid/public space. And it, to a certain degree, becomes a public narrative, depending on how much people you have in your friends, depending on how algorithms are working. And I would say that the factor of algorithms is also very important here, because now algorithms are pretty much having very significant influence on what becomes really a public narrative and what narrative becomes influential. And also your ability to game the arguments, to tweak the arguments, to the algorithms, and go in different ways. So indeed, this ease of creating narratives and also the ease of distributing these narratives, I would say, is really very different, for instance, from the classical schema of Halbwachs, or for instance, the classical schemas of the Assmanns. Even while the idea, I would say, is still pretty much the same, but the way we really produce narratives and also distribute them is really different. So I would actually argue we can find some memory on the Instagram, but the way we're looking for the memory and the way we actually define our findings as memory is kind of different. But yeah, it's a really great question and also a very complex one.
Okay, we still have 2 minutes, but okay, let's say 5 minutes if you have any other questions. Or, okay.
So the question, or rather I would like to share my doubts with Mykola, also about the methodology, because in fact the question is, can we really be sure if we are researching on memory, post-memory memory or vision about something using social media? Because for a young generation, for many people, typing not real date of birth, it's like a rule. So we never know, in fact, who posts and who at the hashtag. And that's the problem then if we research on nostalgia or rather and memory, or because I would connect this increase in adding hashtags 90s not with adolescence of the people that remember 90s or were teenagers then, but with becoming hard users of Instagram by people that cannot remember that and are discovering 90s. And then we've got the results about the vision about the 90s.
Joanna, what do you want to do? You want to just have the final remarks just right now, or you want to take a break? I think maybe it's better, yeah. Okay.